Are you looking to become a leader in clean energy and an expert in clean tech? Do you hope to get noticed in the crowd as you pursue a career in this fastly growing industry? You are in the right place. Join Karan Takar as he invites clean energy leaders to share industry developments, highlight clean tech investment opportunities, and shed light on how you can increase your chances of employment in this high-growth sector. We will also discuss the energy transition across key emerging markets like India and explore partnership opportunities for the U.S. private and public sector. After all, this is the Zenergy podcast.
Well, hello, Dr. Mann. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this podcast. Really excited to dive into your work and learn about your career journey, hear what you're working on these days. But before getting into it, have a somewhat fun question to ask you to kick us off. So your work has had a huge impact on how we understand climate change. But if you weren't a climate scientist, what do you think you'd be doing today? Did you ever consider a completely different path before committing to this field?
Yeah, thanks, Karan. It's good to be with you. And that's a great question. There are times when I've thought it would be fun to do stand-up comedy, but I'm not sure I'm quite up to the task. So I play piano by ear. It's a sort of one of my hidden talents. So you can like throw a song at me and I'll just belt it out on the piano. I sometimes thought it would be fun to work in a sort of seedy bar with a little jar on top of the piano, taking contributions for my cheesy piano playing. More seriously, I suppose, there are just so many fascinating areas today that have emerged in the time since I was in college in the 1980s. I mean, AI is sort of still is a wide open frontier. Sort of the search for extraterrestrial life. Now we're discovering exoplanets, planets in distant systems with Earth-like, properties. There are so many fascinating problems to work on, and that's just on the science side. I mean, on the social science side of things, communication is of great interest to me. The center that I direct here at Penn is really about science communication, and there's a whole sort of science of communication and polling and public survey work and sort of understanding where people are and how to move them in the direction we need them to go. And of course, then there are the sort of business dimensions of the problem. I have a number of colleagues in Wharton who are doing fascinating work on ESG, on sort of climate, assessing the cost of climate change. Wharton folks played an important role in the Inflation Reduction Act in estimating the carbon savings. So, I guess I have the luxury today that because I have this sort of, I have an interest in communicating climate, and it's an interdisciplinary problem that involves, the science, the social science, the humanities, and everything else. There's economics, there's sociology, there's obviously, there are health consequences. Here at Penn, we have expertise in all those areas. And so I'm sort of like a kid in a candy store. I've been here 2 years, and we're forging relationships across the campus with folks in Wharton, with folks in the Kleinman Center, in the medical school, in the vet school. They're doing interesting work that has, looking at the sort of carbon emissions from ag. You name it. Obviously, Annenberg, I have a joint appointment in Annenberg, the Graduate School of Education. There's all this really interesting work going on at Penn. And in the latest strategic vision, Penn has listed climate #1 as, among the 4 sort of larger questions or issues that Penn is sort of well situated to tackle and where we can truly lead in the years ahead. And so You know, there's so many directions one could go in. And unfortunately, you know, when you're in college or you're in graduate school, you've pretty much got to just choose one for the time being that you're going to forge ahead and sort of and develop the depth that's necessary to, you know, to get a degree and to do research in an area. But the nice thing is then when you go out into the real world, whether you go on in academia or you go into the business world, investment, what have you, you've got an opportunity to solve real world problems and to bring together all of these other disciplines and to forge relationships. And so in the end, you sort of almost don't have to choose. You will have an opportunity to work with people across a wide range of disciplines, depending on the sort of problem that you know seek to attack.
Thank you for expanding on that. And I think I speak for a lot of us when I say we are grateful that you ended up choosing the climate field, given all of your pioneering work in the space. But at the same time, I think Penn does have room for a stand-up comedy club.
You know, what was it? There is like one of the student groups. There are a number of like comic comedy groups. And when our daughter just started here at Penn, she's a first-year student in her second week, or what is it, third week now. And we attended the what was it, the Quaker Days for accepted students who would have come back and sort of when they're still making their decision. And one of them performed at sort of the opening ceremony for that, and I was impressed. So I'm not sure Penn needs my contributions to comedy. I think they're doing just fine.
And regarding climate communication, so you've been at the forefront of climate advocacy while navigating a challenging political landscape, to say the least. How do you strike a balance between being a scientist and an advocate? And what strategies have helped you communicate effectively with both skeptics and supporters?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I sort of found myself in an unusual situation. I was a scientist, didn't really have interest in sort of leaving the laboratory. I was sort of perfectly happy to just be, crunching numbers, running models. It's what I loved doing. I was a nerd. I loved being a nerd. That's what I imagined, I'd be doing the rest of my life. But the climate work that we published in the late 1990s, the hockey stick curve sort of took on this larger than life sort of role in the climate debate. And that sort of thrust me into the very fractious, larger debate about climate change and fossil fuels. And I've sort of leaned into that. Ultimately, I've embraced that role. It's given me an opportunity to be part of this larger conversation, although it's not really what I had signed up for. When it comes to sort of communicating the science and its implications to the public, there's this question: should scientists veer away from advocacy? And there are many who feel they should. I actually wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. I guess it's more than 10 years old now. Was it 20? It could have been 2014. The title is "If You See Something, Say Something," which is, of course, the motto of our Department of Homeland Security. But in this context, I was using it to describe the role that we have as climate scientists. We are witness to one of the great threats and challenges that we face as a civilization, the climate crisis. We're sort of down in the trenches. We know better than anybody else what the threat is, what the prospects are for averting catastrophe, because we're immersed in the numbers, because it's what we do. We run climate models. We look at carbon emission scenarios. We study the impacts of different projected levels of warming. And so it would seem odd if those of us who are closest to the science and know what the potential consequences are were to somehow recuse ourselves from this conversation. And so my view, and the view that I expressed in that op-ed, was that it'd be one thing if our if our views about policy was coloring our science, if we were tweaking our calculations to fulfill some policy agenda, that would be wrong. That would be crossing a firewall that shouldn't be crossed. Our science should be objective as possible. Of course, we're human beings. We're all subject to irrational behavior and subjective decisions and bias and all those things that come with us as human beings, and we do our best to sort of remove ourselves from that when we do the actual number crunching, when we do the science. And so we want to avoid sort of having our views of policy or politics impact the science that we're doing, impact the answers that we're getting. But there's nothing at all that's wrong in having the science that we do and our understanding of the implications impact our views as human beings. You don't, as a colleague of mine used to say, you don't sort of check your citizenship at the laboratory door. You're still a citizen, and like any citizen, you have a right to speak out about the things that matter to you. I think we're all advocates for something, right? So all of us are advocates, and for those of us who are in the science and who see the threat, it's totally appropriate for us to be trying to communicate that threat as clearly as we can. I don't think we should have to apologize for being advocates, as I said in the piece, for a fact-based discussion of this problem and what to do about it. That having been said, as you allude to, it has become very politicized. Here we are on the eve of perhaps the only debate between the two presidential candidates this cycle. And I actually polled my class this morning. How many of you think that there'll be a question about climate? And I was surprised. I think 94% of the class thought there would be. So young folks are more optimistic than some of us older folks. I'm a little cynical. I don't, based on everything I've seen thus far, I worry that there won't be a single question about the greatest threat that we actually face as a species, as a civilization. But I hope there is a question, because we all have a right to know where the candidates stand, what they'll do, or even if they even believe there's a problem in the first place. And there's some divergence between the two candidates, even as to whether or not the climate change is real and poses a threat. So it's become very partisan. And in Annenberg, we do polling. The Annenberg Public Policy Center does public survey work on public opinion on climate, and by and large, Republicans, especially older Republicans, younger Republicans, actually are significantly more likely than older Republicans to believe in the science of climate, to accept the science of climate change, and to sort of believe that we need to do something about it. But older conservatives, by and large, the polling shows, tend to reject the notion that climate change is even real. And it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation about solving a problem when one of the parties involved doesn't even accept that the problem exists. And so we sort of have to start. That's the starting point, is an acceptance of what the science has to say. And I try to reach a broad spectrum of audiences in the outreach and the communication that I do. But that having been said, there's a certain stubbornness that one finds among sort of climate dismissives. They're about 10% in the, if you look at the sort of public opinion spectrum on climate, roughly 10% are in that most dismissive category that we call the dismissives, where they simply reject the idea that climate change is even real. And there's quite a bit of work that's been done that shows it's going to be very difficult to change their mind, because they're not really viewing this through the lens of science and sort of rational discourse. It's become tribal. It's become part of sort of one's allegiance to a certain school of thought. And so at some point, you sort of have to maybe give up and not spend and waste all your time trying to convince people who just aren't movable. I tend to focus on what I call the sort of persuadable middle. They're not true believers, they're not deniers, they're normal people who have normal things to worry about in their life. And they have a sense that there's some debate about climate and how bad it's going to be. And as long as there's a debate, well, then they're going to focus on other bread and butter sort of kitchen table issues, things that they really need to deal with in their own lives. And so there's a real opportunity to convince them that climate change is a kitchen table issue, that it's impacting every facet of our lives today. And that persuadable middle, they have, to some extent, their views of climate have been polluted by denialism. They are sort of victims of denialism. They're not villains. But they suffer from a misunderstanding and a lack of knowledge that speaks to the contentious nature of our climate discourse. And a little bit of effort and a little bit of knowledge can often move them into that next category where they really become part of the solution. And so I would say that's where my outreach efforts are focused. Certainly convincing the true believers that, hey, do everything you can, because there's still a lot of uncertainty. In fact, we could get into this whole question about doomism. At the other end of the spectrum, there are those who think it's too late to do anything. It's so bad, there's nothing we can do anymore. And that's not true either. So we have to make sure that they understand that it's not too late to avert the worst consequences. But I think the sweet spot is that persuadable middle.
Looking back on your career, are there any moments that stand out as game changers in how the public perceives climate science? And if so, how did you navigate those moments, / what can we learn from them today as it pertains to being able to educate that middle group that you referenced?
Yeah, it's a great question too. I sometimes refer to this as sort of the Cuyahoga River moment. So back in the 1970s, early 1970s, the Cuyahoga River of Ohio caught on fire, and it sort of galvanized the environmental movement. It's like, we've got a problem. If rivers are catching on fire because there's so much pollution, petroleum, pollutants that literally, caused a river to catch fire. That sort of, and the vivid images of that captured the public imagination. And as I remind people, Richard Nixon founded the EPA. It was a conservative Republican president who recognized, that he did the call. There was demand on the part of the American people. It was an event that sort of galvanized attention and support to do something, and that began the modern environmental movement. Today, we live in a much more fractured and partisan world, a much more divided world. We used to get, most of our information from 3 network TV news programs: NBC, ABC, CBS Evening News. And, everybody sort of was dealing with a common set of facts and could agree to disagree, perhaps, about what their opinions were, the implications of those facts, but we were dealing with a common set of facts. And today, we're not. People can sort of trap themselves in sort of a bubble of epistemic closure. They watch Fox News and they read the the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, and this is where they get all their information from. Or on social media, they only follow, certain very conservative accounts. And you have progressive enclaves as well. I mean, it's true across the spectrum. People tend to be trapped in these sort of bubbles of self-reinforcing sources of information. And it's very difficult to penetrate those bubbles. It's a much more divided media environment that we find ourselves in. The former New York Senator Daniel P. Moynihan once famously said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." Well, today, people feel entitled to their own facts about COVID, about climate, about anything that has the potential to become part of the sort of partisan debate. And that makes it very difficult. It makes it very difficult to to have that moment, right? We thought we had that with Hurricane Katrina. We thought we had that with, the wildfires, the California wildfires that blanketed Lake Tahoe in sort of this dystopian smoke. The Canadian wildfires last summer, which impacted us here in Philadelphia. We had the worst air quality in the world for 3 days because of the wildfire smoke. So there are all of these moments that we've had where the impacts of climate change have become profound. We can very clearly see it's impacting our lives, and yet it hasn't motivated the kind of action that we saw back in the 1970s with the Cuyahoga River fire. And I think that does speak to the far more balkanized state of our discourse today. And we see it in sort of how far apart the two parties are when it even comes to the facts. Is COVID a threat? Is climate change real? These are the sorts of things that are likely to be debated in this debate tonight. So I've become a little cynical that there can be that one moment, that one event, that one galvanizing event. But instead, I subscribe to the notion that there can nonetheless be a tipping point in public consciousness. And there's been some interesting social science research that suggests that, once you reach something like around 25% of the public gets to the point where they consider, an issue to be the foremost issue for them. And we saw this with marriage equality, where once there was something like 25% support for marriage equality, and there was a very strong, what we call issue public, a group of people passionately advocating for it, there was this dramatic tipping point where suddenly, within a period of a year and a half, the majority of Americans supported marriage equality, and we saw it, become the law of the land. There's evidence that can happen once you have, a passionate and strong enough issue public. And I think with climate change, Gen Zers really, many of them rank the climate threat, understandably, because it's all about their future, as the number one issue that we face, the greatest threat that we face. And public support is somewhere around like 25% support, 25% of the public who would rank climate change as one of the greatest threats that we face. So, and public opinion overall, there's clearly a majority of Americans who recognize that it's real and that it's a problem. They're not all convinced that we can do anything about it, or that it's a big enough problem that we have to take action yet. So we're sort of at that stage where we need to continue to push. And if we continue to push forward, I think that tipping point in consciousness will happen. So it may not be one event that precipitates it, because that's not the world we live in anymore. We can't even all agree on what that event was anymore. And with generative AI, we can no longer necessarily believe our eyes and ears when we see video coverage of something. So it's a much more challenging environment, but I think it can still happen. And I think it will happen.
And given that context, I know we only have a few minutes left, so this is my final question. Really appreciate.
Sorry, my answers have been very long, so I'm happy to go a few minutes long.
And informative. And would just love to hear your thoughts on any pieces of advice you would give to either climate scientists, people looking to make an impact in the field on the communication side, in order to help elevate climate further into the public consciousness. And if there are any strategies you found to be effective on this front, would love any pieces of insight there. And thank you again for your time. It's final question.
Yeah, no, thanks. Another great question. What I would say is, find your inner voice, find your passion, find your talent, find what you have to offer. It's easy to watch someone else and see what they do and say, oh, I'll just do what they do because they're very effective at it. But I don't think that generally works, because we all have our own unique talents and proclivities and approaches. And you have to be comfortable in your own skin. You got to be yourself. And I've seen people try to be like somebody else, and it doesn't work because they're not them, when they just need to be a better them, or to find the best them that they can. And I think that's true in communication. I have colleagues who are very effective communicators, but I tell people, don't try to be like Richard, because Richard can do that because that's who he is. That style isn't going to work for you. Find your own style. And I think that's true here with regard to young people sort of figuring out how they can contribute to the solution, because there is a communication component of the challenge. There's a financial, fiscal, economic component. I mean, that's a major part of it, right? Cost benefit analysis, environmental sustainable investment. There are, so if you're in, economics, business, financial markets, there's a really important, and I collaborate quite a bit with people in those fields because they're really contributing to the solution. It may be that the solution, that real action comes about first, not through governmental action, but some of the largest companies and corporations deciding that, hey, this is a threat to our business model. Anything that's a threat to the planet and a threat to our potential customer base and our potential investors is a threat to us. It's sort of like, I think that there is this, we need to expand the notion of fiduciary responsibility in business, because what, greater obligation could you have to your stakeholders, to your investors, than to not destroy the planet that they live on. So I think we need to expand our notion of what fiduciary responsibility means. And so there's a really important role to play, Wharton, business, financial markets, the arts and humanities and ethics, because it's a communication problem. It's a communication problem. There's the science of communication. There's the work in Annenberg that I'm very lucky to be part of here as well. But one of the other areas that Penn is prioritizing is the arts. In fact, the 4 areas that Penn has said that they really want to prioritize in their latest strategic vision is climate, human health, the arts, and democracy. These are, or sorry, not democracy. The arts. I got it. There are 2 different lists. It's climate, human health, democracy, and AI/big data. And all those are interrelated as well. Communication, dealing with the challenges of AI is going to be part of our reality, in how it's a sort of an arms race, in how it's being used by both some parties to disinform the public, and how we need to use it as sort of as a tool for good. But I said, the arts and humanities, which is prioritized as well by Penn, communicating, film, art, music. There are so many affective ways of learning, ways that we learn that are, sort of emotional in nature, and we need to seize control of that. Music is very powerful. How many of some of the movies that move you the most are actually movies that have remarkable soundtracks, right? Because there's a language that we learn. Yes,
with a lot of playing in them.
Yes, no, absolutely. Which is one of my hidden talents. So yes, it all comes together in the end. So we need to, but back to the basic question, that you're asking. So figure out what it is. Everybody has something special to offer, and I absolutely believe that. And here at Penn, I definitely see that with my students. There are just so many amazing students that I have the pleasure of getting to interact with, both undergraduates and graduate students here. And so many of them come in with these talents and abilities that I couldn't possibly, hold myself. And so what I tell them is figure out how to, you've got this amazing ability to do this or this or this. and use that and find a way to use that to achieve, your goals. And if those goals align with, environmental sustainability and climate, that's awesome. Not everybody has to be working on that problem. And sometimes you go off and work on some other problem because you're really interested in it and you're really passionate about it, and you'll make a breakthrough. And that breakthrough may, in fact, help us, sort of fight climate change, meet the climate challenge. And so find your own way, find your voice, listen to your heart. Sometimes you have to go with your heart as much as your head. You have to be guided by that inner voice, and you have to be passionate about what you're doing, because if you're not passionate about it, you're not going to be good at it. And if you're not good at it, you're less likely to make a contribution that's going to help all of us collectively.
It was incredible to have you on the podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure, and happy to come back another time, and we'll have that cup of coffee when you're back on campus.
I would love that. Would
Yeah.
absolutely love that. And thank you, Dr. Mann. It was truly inspiring to hear all of your insights, and I know people will get a lot out of them, as I surely have in these 30 minutes. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you, Karan. Look forward to talking again.